Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video, I want to ramble on for a while about some of the choices that we make, in this case specifically going over weapon third stats, as of course nowadays with also some of the popular exotics having the option of having their third stat reconfigured, and of course we were always able to reroll it on weapons. Going over some of the options and what they all provide. I'm going to give a spoiler warning right here as well, as DTOOC is king, that we're not going to dispute that, but there has been some rumblings, there always has been some rumblings of, hey, what if I pick something else, and some people even promoting it. We'll go over why DTOOC is king, and we'll also go over on LMGs, where DTOOC is already there and is already a king there, so we get to pair it with a queen, and what choices we make there. Then also we're also going to go into ceska versus grupo, specifically for Elmo and Oreo on strikers, as I feel there is some debate always going on there, and I see a lot of people recommending grupo, especially on Elmo. There, ceska definitely wins. We're going to go over those. Even as well, we're going to go over why I do actually put ceska in Oreo strikers as well. And yeah, we'll discuss all that as we'll go over a spreadsheet I've prepared, and this is very much going to be a spreadsheet video. So let's jump right into it. And to set up the premise of what we're going to discuss here, we're going to go over the choices that we can make basically in this slot that I've selected here, which is the third stat, which we usually call the third stat because it's the third stat on weapons, although of course on pistols it isn't. The first two, the core attributes, as it states here, they're not changeable to anything else. They'll be the class's damage, and then they'll have per class, per weapon type, a specific stat as their secondary. For instance, on ARs, of course, here is the health damage. And then we have this third attribute where we can actually change it. And of course, with Elmos and Oreos and Sacrums, the one that everybody forgets in the Sacrum that also has that option, just because nobody really uses it, we have the option of reconfiguring them till we get the right attribute that we want. On high-end weapons, we can just recalibrate it, of course. And we have a choice of a selection of choices, and it is, of course, different stats and different amounts. We'll go over a spreadsheet that just basically lays those out. Then we also have a few in here that, of course, aren't providing any damage per se, or changing anything towards burst and sustain. We'll also go over those, at least what it would cost in damage-wise to pick them. And of course, the common thing to put there, as I have basically in the entirety of my AR collection here, is it's detox all the way down, except what was that? Oh, that was I think I was testing something with magazine size with this one, but then yeah, that was testing purposes. For the rest, it's detox, and purples, which don't have a third stat. But for the rest of them, it's mostly rerollable talents on the high ends, and then on all my named items, I've chosen to have the third stat just as an option. Maybe they'll change something in the future. If we go over to our spreadsheet that I've prepared for today, we'll start off with giving a brief introduction to what this is. If you haven't seen these before, these are multi-calculators. They are of my design. There's a video on my channel explaining them quite in depth if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about them. But to give the basics, input happens down here. There's up to 10 builds being compared, and output happens up here with the same 10 builds. They're color-coded to match, just so it's easier to catch the eye with it. And what we're especially getting at is a burst and sustain DPS number that we can use to compare with in percentages, and all of these percentages are comparing to the one in the top slot, which is in this case DTOOC. It's also giving us some damage numbers to test it at the range or in game with if we're getting matching numbers, meaning that we have input all of our stats correctly. And of course, I've tested, DTOOC made sure that that works. So the stats inputs are correct. And of course, I've altered in points the stats to where required, where magazine size, of course, affects it, the magazine size and stuff. We're going to discuss, first off, DTOOC. We're going to go into no damage third stats, which is, for instance, the accuracy, stability, in this case, optimal range, also swap speed, even though swap speed should never be picked because it does nothing. Rate of fire, DTA, damage to armor, DTH, damage to health, CHD, crit damage, critical hit damage, let's say it all out, headshot damage in HSD, reload speed, mag size, and CHC being critical hit chance. We're going to discuss all of those, what they do to our damage output numbers. Now, we can already give the conclusion if you're interested in what you should pick, DTOOC. As I stated a little second ago, DTOOC is the highest output just because it is the highest activeness and it is also the highest amount added with its 10%. Let's jump into its number.
Don't want him to get rusty.
And that is, of course, this 10 DTOOC. The damage to targets out of cover. I usually, in typing it out, I'll put 2 T's and 2 O's. In saying it, I just say DTOOC just because DTTOOC is a little hard to say many times in a row. It has an activeness. There is some, I feel, just poor understanding in a lot of people in when out of cover is and isn't active for enemies. In the future, I'll likely do an only tip explaining that. I feel that would be a good thing to have for the community. But in general, we can say that it is one of the higher active ones because even when enemies are in cover and considered in cover, especially reds and purples, you can stagger them out with 1 or 2 shots with a hard-hitting build. Just Elmo on a striker will get them out of cover pretty quickly. And when they detach from the cover, they're considered out of cover. Meaning that depending on as well who you're playing with, because it kind of depends as well if you're running a Regulus build and you're literally one-shotting a territory control second spawn when they spawn in, the second they spawn in their spawn door, 0% would be in cover ever. If you have a foam eclipse in your group, a very small percentage will ever be in cover because when they're foam, they can't actually attach to cover in the same way that players can't. But if you're solo with a very bad build, with a blue build, you're letting everybody get out, everybody get into cover. You don't know where the spawns are, so you don't know to head in certain directions once once they start spawning and stuff. You might get this percentage down quite a bit, but then still you're getting them out of cover once you start shooting them. Even with a full blue build, with a AR or SMG, in 6-7 shots, you'll get them out, staggering and out of cover. The number I usually keep in mind for damage to targets out of cover is around 90% activeness. So let's set it to that. That alters this number here, and that alters our outputs in comparison, the percentages. It decreases this output, so the percentages jump around. What we can see then is that actually DTA and DTH, especially on burst, which is the one we're gonna concern ourselves the most with, they're kind of catching up. But as you may see already popping up here, we have some activeness for them as well. And their activeness, to me, is always going to be lower than damage to targets out of cover, especially for, I feel the more competent you are, the higher this number basically gets, because you'll kill enemies more while they're spawning because you'll know their spawn points. You'll know how to deal with enemies that even set up in cover. For instance, the LMGs from Outcast have the ability to set up. They'll have that little circle above their head. They'll set up and unload. And while they're doing that, they're basically unstaggerable, but not unfoamable, for instance. So once you kind of know how to deal with stuff, this number will be around this 90% because you'll still have elites going into cover and you need like 4 or 5 shots onto them to get them out of cover. So a 90% I feel is pretty indicative of normal gameplay. And of course, if you're like fighting raid bosses and stuff, this number is very important because they're not going to go, Razorback is not going to take cover. So you have 100% activity on it. We'll put it back to 100% as well here, and we'll continue on to the second number. And that second number set we're going to look at is for no damage turns, which is accuracy, stability, optimal range. All three are useful things, but you're giving up a ton of damage. You're giving up 10%, which a 10% DTOOC if you're giving up that for things that actually, especially if you even wanted them, even if you really wanted more accuracy and stability, it's really important to you. You have other options, and that is to still take DTOOC on the weapon and then take weapon handling on gear. Giving up 1 crit damage roll on your gear is a lot less of a loss than here, and that will get you 8 with a 8 weapon handling roll. You'll get 8 accuracy and 8 stability. Of course, you'll get 12 from a stat, but even on most builds, unless you're very low on crit damage, you could give up 2 crit damage rolls and still be a tiny amount ahead with just having this DTOOC roll be here. And of course, at that point, you have 16 accuracy and 16 stability, which you, will beat out having just 1 accuracy or 1 stability. Having 24% optimal range as well is not something that will, in effect, change this, because even if you're outside of your optimal range and in your fall off, and your optimal range may have increased that to be in there, the cases when you have that will not beat this DTOOC because you'll also shoot at a lot of enemies while inside of your optimal range. The other option is, of course, swap speed, and never pick swap speed. Swap speed is currently broken. It does not have any effect, it seems. It definitely doesn't affect your swapping speed. The animation just takes just as long. This has been tested quite a bit here, and it did used to work. We have confirmed in the past, or footage from the past that confirms that at some point, especially I think the footage I saw, it was in season 2. It worked back then. At some point it broke. It never got fixed. Maybe in the future. But then still, you should not choose to pick that because you're better off with weapon handling again, just providing that because it does provide that as well. Reload speed as one of the other options we'll go into here in a second, because that actually does apply, of course, to sustain damage. So we will definitely look at that one. Let's move on to rate of fire. And that is always an interesting debate point in many games, actually. First off, though, just because it is relevant and I haven't done it yet, the build we are actually using there as the stat blocks of is this one, an Elmo striker with chest, with a ceska piece and a coyote. We're using this to compare, and of course the Elmo has a relevancy here with it having a third stat that is reconfigurable to get to reroll till you get it. One thing that is relevant here, because we're going to discuss rate of fire, if we were to put rate of fire on the Elmo, which we haven't here, we would also be having this 15% rate of fire from strikers. And rate of fire is, of course, going to add in, if you're going to look at it from the perspective of DPS, it is on the other side of damage, adding in there to there. Normally, we're most concerned about just getting an RPS number, and then the damage number is the one that we fully calculate out with most of the stats applying to that. Rate of fire is adding into the other side, which is the RPS side, which is coming from the RPM of the weapon, and is additive as a pool, which is the important part that I want to get to. As if we put rate of fire on the weapon, we're getting a combined pool of 20%. It isn't multiplicative to itself, as some people have stated. I've seen that be stated outright, and it's very wrong. And you can test that for yourself by having running strikers, putting rate of fire on your weapon, and comparing the two calculations. Because if it's plus or if it's times 1.2 with a combined of 1.5 and a 5, that's one number. And then if it was self-multiplicative and it was times 1.15 times 1.05, that would give a different number. The number we see in-game matches it being additive. If we then jump back into the spreadsheet, there is also, of course, then the two separate ways of thinking about rate of fire, and that is kind of dependent on build as well, because rate of fire as well doesn't change your damage on your shots, meaning that it doesn't feed into any of your ammo economy or stuff like that. You aren't changing your damage per mag, especially as a concern. And then the other side of that coin is, of course, your rate of fire is a little bit higher, so you're stacking a little bit better, making stacking on oblitz rate, on strikers and stuff a little bit more efficient. Both sides have a valid argument. To me, just the 5% doesn't matter. It is too low of a value to make a difference. 15% on strikers even is not enough to really turn it one way or another. If you could have a choice between having 100% DTOC or 100% rate of fire, at that point you might start having actual discussions about maybe ammo economy is a little bit more important. Maybe the stacking ability is a little bit more important. But as well, going back to why DTOC wins, because DTOC, like the house in casinos, the house always wins. Here, DTOC always wins, is that it's 5%. That is the simple part of it, even though it is also additive and giving a little bit of a lossy / diminishing returns, basically, for that 5%. It isn't that the issue, it's just 5% versus 10%. In effect, if it was even at its full 5%, calculation-wise, it doesn't matter if you're adding an extra multiplier on the end of on the rate of fire side or on the damage side, because those two sides are just the way we see them usually as separated, but they're also multiplying against each other. And seeing as everything in that calculation, except for instance headshot and crit damage, you bracket them together, but the rest of it, the order doesn't matter, and where you put that 5% in this case doesn't matter. It just matters that one is 5%, one is 10%, even though of course rate of fire is always active. It's always going to be active. DTOC, as we discussed, isn't, but even if we take DTOC to 9%, or 90% activeness by making it a 9% stat, rate of fire still isn't going to catch up, of course. Let's move on to the next interesting one, which is DTA. And of course, there's been quite a little bit of debate recently on DTA to DTH ratios and values and how active it is. Because again, if we're going to discuss DTA, we have a number here. First off, the number is smaller. That is kind of the issue actually for DTA. The interesting thing is that the values are much closer to each other at World Tier 5 at level 30, where DTOC isn't 10. They're much closer to each other. Here at level 40, the one we care about, as most of us are there, it's 6% for DTA for that third stat and 10% for DTOC. And I would say as well that DTOC has a much higher activeness. There has been a lot of debates that has flared up recently about DTA and DTH. I'm going to throw out two numbers here, 60% for DTA, 40% for DTH, which is just the average that I use in the same way that I use 90% average for damage to RSF cover. This is, of course, going to vary wildly per content, so you kind of have to keep that in mind. If you're doing Heroic Countdown, almost everything is elite. If you're not fighting Black Tusk, you're only going to get a few Black Tusk at Extraction. You might get a heavy there with a lot of health. For the rest of it, it's just going to be elites, and they're going to have a ratio of about... And it seems that they're in Heroic Countdown, they're using the same health and armor values around Legendary, it seems. Meaning that... yeah, enemies, especially names, have humongous amounts of armor, and with a ratio of 1 to 3, 3.5-ish, 4 for the health versus armor. And that stacks up quite a lot, meaning that DTOC or damage to armor might be as active as 80%, 85% there. And especially on top of that, if you care about, for instance, raid bosses, if you care about incursion bosses, and those are your primary targets, and you really want your damage to apply on there, That's, for instance, the reason why we have taken to going contractors for specifically incursions. Now, this ratio, of course, the camp that has come out recently, they go 50-50 about it. It's a dumb number to me. DTA is usually going to be more active than DTH, especially for players that play higher end content, and also what the most of the community does do, I feel, is matchmake for some stuff, at the very least countdowns and stuff. 50-50, I don't think you're going to reach as a general number unless you're only doing invaded missions and doing them solo. And yeah, that's I don't think that player might exist. So you kind of have to pick your own ratios. It's kind of what you feel. Also, I just want to go on a tangent here, and their proclaimment that nobody has tested these numbers and stuff, and that's why we're like, this is the person putting them forward is like the first person. No, the rest of us did this 3 years ago. The rest of us did this when WONI came out, and a little bit later as well when they made the changes to how many elites were in heroic, because around the release of WONI, everything on heroic was all elites always, which was a weird choice. They rebalanced everything a little bit later, so we did those testing back then. And here again as well, I've prepared the activeness. If we actually put damage to targets that cover on the 90, that like kind of my general number is, and we put as well armor on 60%, we're of course taking a bigger number, giving it a higher percentage, and we're taking a smaller number and giving it an even smaller percentage. And yeah, it's, of course, never is going to win. To give an somewhat interesting number here, if we put damage or damage to armor to its full value, of course, we would of course need just around 60% DTA active or DTOOC activeness to get the same percentages, because that's when they line up, which is something I feel will never happen. You won't have the thing happening of damage to targets out of cover being this low unless there is a boss that goes into cover, which I don't think, like a raid boss going into cover and then you shooting him a lot with damage to armor here. But then even then they would have a health bar underneath it, which might be, even if it's a ratio of like 10-1, it is still, that is still quite a little chunk out of this, taking this a little bit lower. So yeah, let's move on to its counterpart of DTH or DTA, which is of course DTH. And for DTH, we have to of course concern ourselves with one thing. That is, if we go back into the game, we're using Elmo stats here. It is an AR, and ARs, of course, have a second stat being health damage. To keep it a little bit more overview friendly, because otherwise we would have DTA being way far behind everything, because when DTA is active, of course, DTH isn't, but when DTH is active, this number is going to be, every other number is going to have plus 21, basically, a 1.21 multiplier applied to them when DTA isn't, so it would have given skewed numbers here. Now, one thing that will happen though is that damage to health is, as a stat, is additive to itself. So we're getting 10% from damage to health roll on the weapon, even though when you roll it onto a weapon, it says 9.5%. If you actually check your stats and actually also compare it calculation-wise, it is actually 10%, which is one of the oddities that actually I had forgotten for a while. And I think Scooby brought it up recently. I went like, oh yeah, that was a thing. Totally forgot. And that's because we also, never put DTH on a weapon. So we don't really use it in that way. Here, to make DTH as a number and having the option as well of turning DTH on for all of the other numbers for comparison's sake, I have actually taking that 10% that we do get from that 9.5% attribute that when we roll it onto a weapon and get 10% out of it from going from visually to actual stats. We're taking the diminished returns of it. So we're taking the new stat versus the old stat that would be, and we're just looking at the difference in percentage that they would add. And we can take that number, actually, this 8.26%, we can put it here. It's truncated to 8.3%. We'll leave it as that just to not have a humongous number here. Then we have the option here of turning on DTH for all of the numbers. Let's actually do that here, and we'll go in here and put this to 1. And DTH becomes active. And now, of course, we can see that the DTA number has fallen behind humongously, because, of course, it is. It's basically 6% versus 21% on everything else. Now, of course, even actually when this is, of course, on an enemy that we're hitting with health, it would actually not even be this number, of course, with the DTA, because the DTA wouldn't be active at that point. So it would just be a no damage third, basically. It would be this number, but then without that 21% on top of it. So yeah, 6%, for instance, would actually just go away. So it would even be less. That's also the reason we usually don't go with those, because yeah, DTOOC we can first, we have some control over making it active when we care about it, if it's on names and stuff. DTA and DTH, we don't have that much control over, except, for instance, in, of course, things like PvP, where contractors is quite common and quite effective as well. There we have a lot more control that we're fighting enemies that will have armor quite often. So this, of course, again, is looking at it from a PvE stance, but that still also wouldn't change the outputs here, because still, again, it's just bigger number wins. So if we take DTH here and let's remove the weapon 1 being active, we'll put that back to that. So this 8.3% represents that 10%, but how much it would actually add in together with that 21%. So it will be that 10% on top of that 21% will just be an 8.3% increase. Now, this 8.3 as well, of course, has an activity. To me, it's around 40% active. It is a bigger number than, of course, there with it being health roll versus the DTOOC. But even if we put DTOOC back to 90% activity, as we had it there from before, a 40% activity on this is going to give a tiny return here. Now, of course, one other thing to point out here, as I should have done that at the start actually, but I totally forgot, we can't put DTH on here because, of course, it is an AR. So yeah, if we go back to it, you can't put health damage on this AR because, of course, it already has it. But this, of course, is also kind of, I'm theorizing all of the numbers. The percentages will hold true even between them outside of crit damage and headshot, because those vary between the weapon types. But this will hold true for instance, SMGs and stuff as well between these ratios, because of course just the other numbers change. So the numbers out here change, but well, outside of DTH here, which we can't put on there. The numbers would hold true, for instance, for SMGs, although, of course, then you would be at the full 10% because you're not getting diminishing returns. But this is more like a thought exercise kind of thing. Let's move on to the next one, which is going to be critical hit damage. And critical hit damage, of course, is going to feed into our stat down here. It's filling into a very large pool. And it's only 10% again. And this is, of course, basically a prime example of diminishing returns. So if we look at our critical hit damage number and we see it's a burst output, we can see it's not that much higher than just not having a damaged turret. It's closer to not having a damaged turret than to have rate of fire, for instance, which was just a 5% additive to another number. So even giving diminishing returns there and stuff. it's pretty bad. So why is that? The reason is because we already have a decent amount of it. So we're putting in the numbers here as they would be for as well a coyote being active at 15 to 25. That's taking us both to that 60 crit chance that we have here, and also giving us a little bit more in the crit area. And at these kind of high numbers, you're getting both first diminishing returns for the stat itself, but also, of course, crit damage comes as a 10 crit damage roll. And it has first, it's applying as a chance. So it's applying at 60% of that 10. So it's already at 6. So it's coming in with the same number as DTOOC, but it's actually as a damage number the same as contractors would be, or not contractors, damage to armor third would be. And then it's going into a pool that is heavily filled and is giving barely anything in return. And this is the same reason, because it's basically that same 6%, that 10% getting 60% crit chance. So it has a 60% activeness, you could see it as. But it's going into a different pool that has already 183 into it. And yeah, it's barely giving us anything in return. Of course, here we have headshot active as well. So we're kind of doing a theoretical with having 100% headshot. And we kind of need that, of course, for having headshot as a stat there in a second. Of course, you will actually get better returns than this, because your headshot percentage won't be 100%, most likely. you'll get, depending on content, anywhere between 10% to 20%. Although, yeah, something like incursions where you're headshotting the lovebirds, where you're headshotting right, and you have a booster hive going that's overcharged and stuff. You might get all the way up to 40, 50% headshots from your hits. Now, taking this away, these two are the crit damage and the headshot, of course, additive to each other. So taking a headshot away would increase this ratio between these numbers. So the percentage in comparison would be a little bit higher. We'll leave it as is, just because, yeah, it's just not enough. It's the same. It's the same issue that the other ones have. If DTA, for instance, was 12% DTA versus 10% DTOOC, we might have a discussion there. But with just the low amounts that it's giving, it's just not worth it in these cases. Let's move on to headshot right away as well. Now, headshot has the same issue, kind of. It's feeding into a pool that is already filled in. One thing to keep in mind is that just having your watch, the base amount and of the weapon and your watch, is already putting it at 75%. So, for instance, in the case of strikers, as we're using the, we're already starting with 75 headshot. We're taking that to 85 headshot. Now, of course, that's not as big of a number as we're dealing with the crit, but it is already a heavily filled in pool still, and we see that as well on the numbers return, because while larger and kind of in the same ballpark as rate of fire. This rate of fire, of course, is going to be always active on every shot you're, well, it's not active on the shot you're taking, but on the interval between shots, meaning that DPS output-wise, they're close to each other. The rate of fire is still winning out. So yeah, you would never pick headshot, because yeah, you could just pick rate of fire, which is higher, or you could just pick DTOOC, which is much higher. With the benefits and downsides of rate of fire, of course, there as well. The two interesting ones we have here is reload speed and mag size. Now, reload speed could be interesting, not on a weapon that is as fast reloading on the case of an Elmo, which already on a striker with its weapon handling is reloading in 1.7 seconds. So this is just taking it down to 1.5, adding that reload speed in. Reload speed, of course, does not affect burst DPS at all, so it is the same as having no damage turns in its burst DPS. It is affecting the sustain, and that extra reload speed is actually increasing the sustain over the no damage challenge by quite a bit, and is actually competing with even rate of fire on sustain. But we don't really care about sustain. Sustain is, as we'll go into in the in-depth guide as well, is an important number, but the number that you usually use to compare is burst, because burst is we'll go into it in the in-depth guide as I might go on a very long ramble here. But what you could see is what I usually do for myself is I will look at the burst DPS number, and then I will take into consideration its sustained DPS and its damage per mag. Now, we're not outputting the damage per mag on this damage calculator, but those two numbers can influence a decision, especially if they're way low. So if you can get a good burst, but your sustain is horrendous in comparison to another choice, I might consider moving to that other choice. But in general, you compare just on burst. It's the number that is going to be most indicative of what you should expect within gameplay. And that's kind of what we care about mostly, because even though we're comparing in here with numbers, eventually we care about mostly the game and the gameplay and how we can use it in there. If we move on as well to max size right away, max size, of course, is increasing the max size number. We are getting a percentage increase here. It's not going to be great, especially on a weapon. Even with Elmo, with its 70 rounds, it is a multiplicative of the amounts that the max size is, because, of course, one of the things is that most weapons you will have plus this many rounds as a mod. Of course, on ARs, on normal FAMAS, you would have the plus 20 magazine. This magazine size is multiplicative to it because it's a different stat. Of course, it is additive to the stats coming from 3-piece Brazos and 3-piece Brazos and 3-piece True Patriot or 2-piece True 3-piece True Patriot. Now, the reason max size is usually not worth it is if you want this, just go on LMG. What are you doing? What are we doing here? And of course, again, we have the issue, it's not feeding into our burst at all. It is only feeding into our sustain. And actually, we can see that with that 9 extra rounds, sustain-wise, we would be better off just reloading a little tiny amount faster than having that extra magazine size, which is the only interesting outcome of this. But again, it is not something you would do just because you're, why leave this damage on the table? Why do 14.1 million when you can do 15.5 million DPS? Now, crit chance, of course, is the last one here. And I've put it at the end because it requires, of course, a little bit of alteration. And the reason for crit chance being different here, of course, it requires alteration to the build to take the most out of it. And that is, of course, in this case, we're looking at it as if we've put crit chance here. So we're getting 9.5 crit chance from the weapon extra here. That puts us way over, and we don't really have anywhere else to bleed crit damage from, or a crit chance from. We only have crit damage rolls. So what we would have to do at that point is take a different brand bonus here, because we would be going way over with the plus 10 from the Coyote as well. So we're altering the build a little bit to make it give better results, the best results it can. And that's also why this grupo is stated there. If we then take the stats of the build, as I showed it there, basically swapping out the ceska holster for a grupo holster, we can see that it is not the worst choice, mostly because also, of course, this has 100% activity. This is, while, of course, it is chance-based on the crit chance, but when you're averaging out, there is no enemy that just completely ignores crit damage. Now, DTOOC, of course, still wins, and that's just amount-wise. We're not getting enough crit chance on weapons to make a good case for it against DTOOC. And that has always been the case. It's, again, kind of like with crit damage. Its amounts, while high, pretty high in the way of having 9.5, we have better ways of getting crit chance, but we don't really have better ways of getting damage to targets out of cover outside of putting, of course, a Fox's Prayer in here. But that would cost us crit chance in its way as well. So we're much better off just making sure that the build-wise we're getting our crit chance there, and then taking the DTOOC, this 10% DTOOC there. And that just gives ends results that are much, much, much better. And yeah, that's kind of the case always with all of these search stats. And we know this, of course, already. The general advice, always take DTOOC. The only place you don't take DTOOC is LMGs, and that's just because they already have DTOOC. Now, there is a case to be made for some sniper builds and stuff as well, where you're headhunting. You will have enemies go into cover, so it might be a choice to go, some go DTA, some go DTH. DTH as well can be a choice for especially Hunter's Fury shotguns. When you're double shotgunning anyway, you might have one paired with damage targets out of cover, one with DTH. That's because DTH does feed into the headhunter calculation, which is a weird one. And there, for instance, DTA and DTH in those cases, in the stated cases, not specifically that shotgun, but for instance, DTA for the snipers, where they're might be shooting at things in cover, actually, for once or twice, because enemies have a tendency when being shot at with a sniper rifle to seek cover as quickly as possible. So that's the times when something like DTA, DTH, or something else might be a choice. But in general, as well, for all of the utility things like accuracy and stuff as well, even if you wanted them, you're better off taking DTOOC and taking weapon handling on the gear itself. Let's move on to a second one I have underneath here, and we'll go through it much faster because, of course, in this one I did a lot of explaining, but as you see there, there's a second one of these. Let's jump right into that one. And in this second part, we're, of course, going to discuss a special case. Some eagle-eyed of you may have noticed there that the numbers changed between that cut there as we went from a recording yesterday to me recording this a day later, because I had an RPM error in the previous one. So we're re-recording it. It affected all of them equally, so the percentages between them stayed the same. But let's do it with the right numbers now. And of course, LMGs are a special case, and that is because they come with damage to targets out of cover already as a second stat. So we already have the best pick, basically, as well, with 2% more even on it. And what do we pair that with becomes the question. I'm going to say usually my general recommendation is Rate of Fire. That's also why I have Rate of Fire here. The other one is Crit Chance, if you can make it fit. Now, in most cases, you can make Crit Chance fit, and that's actually usually the better choice for the for LMGs. We'll go into that, of course, in our table once we reach there. To show the alteration that we needed to do to the build as well, we have, of course, a high-end weapon. This one can only has 3 mods where it can have a crit chance, meaning that we land on 15 crit chance versus the almost 20 that we had before with the ARs. Meaning that we are altering the build a little bit and putting in 1 crit chance mod, which is the way we run it for high ends, of course. And that will factor into a little bit of differences, especially in the DPS output, of course. And let's jump into its numbers, starting with Rate of Fire. And here, of course, as I said, the one I recommend the most is Rate of Fire and Crit Chance. They're bookending this one. We'll start off with Rate of Fire. Rate of Fire, of course, again, feeds into our DPS, especially our burst DPS more than the other ones. That's also why it is winning more on burst DPS than sustained DPS against DTA and DTH, which are some of the ones that often gets recommended. And of course, if you actually look at the full numbers, at their full values, they do seem to be winning out. And yeah, that would be the case, again, if you were to look at them in that way. We're just going to jump in right away and yeah, use those numbers I did before as well and put them to 60 and 40 activeness for general uses. And there we see that they lose out, but not by much. They're just tiny amounts behind on burst and a tiny amount ahead actually on sustain. And that's of course because rate of fire affects burst DPS more than it does sustain DPS positively, because it is in fact decreasing the firing time, and because of that it is increasing the ratio of reload to firing time, which is what sustain is based on. So but of course it's just 5%. And again, here with strikers, rate of fire is actually at its biggest disadvantage that it will face, where it is feeding into a pool that already is only filled in with 15. It's not much, but it is still diminishing the return that we're getting from this rate of fire roll, where of course DTA and DTH in this case, this specific case, are set up where they are a fresh new multiplier, so they're at their full strength. And they're still, then they're not winning. They're matching somewhat, but they're still not winning, especially well, once we set this activeness. And just to be clear, this activeness is bias. Usually colloquially, we use the term bias only to mean bad. You know, when someone is biased, we see that as a bad thing, which we should. But in fact, when we just pick numbers, that is bias. We are picking arbitrary numbers. We're choosing to fit it that way, and we should recognize it as such. It is important to do so, to go which parts are up to interpretation and which parts are set, like the amounts that rate of fire is 5% is not an arbitrary choice on our part. That is just a set number. How much we believe it affects, for instance, stacking and stuff, is then a bias that we will infer upon it. And yeah, so it's highly dependent on what you think this ratio is. I'll be sticking to 60-40 for most of my calculations. But of course, this spreadsheet is available. You can make a copy to it to your own Google Drive and play around with the numbers if you want to. And it is, I feel, a very educational thing to do, as I've done that in the past with many and other people's calculators, and try to reverse engineer how they've done stuff. If we then move on to crit hit damage, we see that it just loses out to DTA and DTH, even with the numbers that we've picked here. It's also, of course, still loses out to rate of fire, which has no activeness really. It is basically always active. It is affecting our, for instance, ammo economy a little bit negatively, but that's a minor point here because it's also a minor amount. All of these are tiny amounts. They're affecting our numbers. They're getting our, although, well, let's be clear that, yeah, it is more than 4% damage difference here, meaning that it will be noticeable. Anything above 2% is where I usually say, if you're familiar with a build, if more than 2% damage gets added or lost, you'll at least feel a difference. You'll go like, something's different here. With headshot, while it seems to be holding up, this is, of course, assuming 100% headshotting, which the second that you actually try to infer how active this headshot number is, and you put in a headshot amount of like 30% or something, which is like, if you're really try-harding, you might reach. This, of course, falls down quite far in comparisons to the activeness that DTA and DTH then have. Max size and reload, as always, don't feed into burst DPS. They only feed into sustained DPS. And again, this is the reason we do actually use sustained DPS, because otherwise none of these kind of stats would make sense. And of course, if you have the ability to have like an infinitely fast reload or something, that will actually sometimes be worthwhile, because fast stance is a very valuable choice. And here we're actually using fast stance numbers, and that's kind of hurting reload speed as the stat here, because I'm kind of acting as if this weapon has fast stance, which it actually does as well, but we're acting as if it has as if it's hitting its cap of 40 stacks, which needs a little bit under 80 hits for it to do so, which is not out of the realm of possibilities. When you have 100 max size, getting 80 rounds out of it, you won't do it always, of course, because that would mean you would have a 80% accuracy, which generally we don't hit general 80% accuracy. But from time to time, when you're shooting a chunk or something, you might get this full reload buff. That's taking it down from the base 4.5 seconds, I believe, to this 2 seconds. But we're adding in already a ton of reload speed from that, and I'm actually just adding this one into that same pool, meaning we're diminishing the returns we're getting here heavily, because we're getting 120 reload speed already from just fast hands, and of course we have then on top of that our watch and stuff as well still. And yeah, that means that we're not getting the returns here. Now, of course, if we weren't using fast hands or something, we could have a bigger return here. And I was thinking of setting that up some way to toggle it between fast hands and not, but the difference is still tiny on its sustain, and it still didn't win out to max size, so I just left it out just for brevity here. And then, yeah, max size, having that max size increase is also not going to make a noticeable difference. It, of course, doesn't affect burst at all, and our sustain isn't increased by enough to even beat out rate of fire, which is actually affecting our sustain the least. And that's just value-wise. These two values would need to be much higher, same for crit damage, for them to compete. Now let's go to the special case here, which is crit chance, as I said as well. Two that I recommend are rate of fire and crit chance if you can fit it. Now, in the case of Striker, actually, I've prepared here the build as it would become if we were going to go crit chance. I haven't done that here actually, but just imagine we have put crit chance here. We've put in a contractors, because of course contractors can fit in here. We can get the damage to armor from that, and our LMG is actually active for once, as we usually run contractors on builds where we're running it with SMGs or ARs and just taking that hit. Here we can actually have it be active. What we would need, though, we had already one crit chance mod in the backpack here. We would need actually another crit chance mod somewhere, or a crit chance roll, one of these rolls to be a crit chance. So we're acting as if we do have that, and then taking that number from that and having the LMG have it as well. So we're taking some liberties to make it theoretical here, but it will still line up. And here we see that as we have it here with its full activeness, it beats it out by a lot. And of course, with the rearrangement of the build, we're getting 8% DTA here, basically, where of course that is coming at the loss of that we're needing that crit chance there. But that is lining up pretty well. And actually, if we set it to the same 60% that I generally say, and have it be that activeness, we still see that it still wins out, and by more than 2%, so a feelable amount. And this is the case usually if you can make crit chance fit. And of course, the reasons you can't sometimes make crit chance fit is mostly, for instance, Negotiator and Umbra, where it doesn't fit in because they already have their own crit chance bonuses. You could still, lose some crit chance in some way, for instance, going both Contractors and Fox. But at that point, you're giving up Coyote, so, but just to, especially align the choices that I make here and say why I make them is, usually rate of fire and crit chance. But yeah, usually crit chance, of course, requires its own build layout. And that's kind of the reason I usually generally go with rate of fire, because although, of course, now it has changed a little bit with the Elmo coming in with its 20% crit chance. In the past, you could pair an LMG with rate of fire quite easily with the AR, with DTTOOC, because they would line up with the same crit chance amounts, having three. Well, if it was a 3-mod weapon, having the 3 crit chance mods be crit chance, and then they would line up together. And then rate of fire was the easy choice, because if you took the crit chance here, they would be misaligned with each other. And that was usually the case to go for rate of fire. Now, actually, crit chance usually fits in well. And actually, crit chance on an LMG, pairing it with the Elmo quite often works well as well, because then you have actually a weapon that if you're Elmo is set up for the 15 to 25 buff. You actually have 4.5 crit chance more on the LMG, and you can use that at close range, being closer to the crit cap when the Coyote buff goes into short range. So there is still some shenanigans you could do there, but yeah, LMGs just don't find the use nowadays. They are a little bit lacking on their burst. Their sustain is still fine, but they're lacking on their burst and their suppression mechanic, where LMGs tend to suppress enemies more, means that they don't find that much use, especially in group play, where suppression is rightly so as well seen as a mechanic that you don't want to have. Although depending on how coordinated your team is, you can still make very effective use of LMGs, especially if you're running together with a fire or foam eclipse, because enemies on fire or foam don't get suppressed. So it is very reliant kind of on other factors, where ARs are just work. it just works. LMGs need some loving from the player, and while I do enjoy them, yeah, they don't end up favorably against their AR and SMG counterparts. Let's move on to the next part. Although actually, turns out we won't do that today, as this is a future IKEA. Having looked at what past IKEA has rambled on about for way too long about the weapon third stats, we're gonna actually leave it there. As I put there in intro, there is actually more that I wanted to discuss today. Upon the reflection and seeing the runtime of what I've already recorded, we're going to split it into two parts. Basically, we'll come back to this dilemma of ceska versus grupo, especially in the form of what do you put in the chest slot or in one of the other slots for a general use striker set, which the answer is ceska. We'll provide some numbers for it, at least for the Elmo, I should be clear. There can be some debate for the Oreo. But yeah, we'll split that up. We'll come back to it. I'll make it a little bit more... we'll put some more meat on these bones and then come back to it and do a full rambling talk on those. Although that will be likely a few videos away, as yeah, the next video is going to be the only tips for Hollywood, which doesn't have only tips yet, and it will start when this video is live. And I'll follow that up with as well a build showcase for a mortar build, and very specifically actually this mortar build with sacrifice, and also of course the Empress variant. We'll go over those and we'll give them a full build showcase, as they're very pertinent of course to Hollywood. And we'll then come back to the subject of doing some spreadsheeting, although of course I'll leave the spreadsheet as is in the link, so you can already actually go and spoil yourself on the grupo versus ceska calculations, although I'll expand upon them. As actually my initial thought was that the weapon third stats might be too short of a video. Turns out I can ramble with the best of them. Although of course most people knew that already, but I wasn't expecting it to go as in-depth as I actually did in the end. Although I'm very happy with it, because yeah, we went pretty in-depth on all of the stats, which I feel will be useful to there should be something new, hopefully, to most people in there that might give them some new insights. But yeah, we'll leave it there, and we'll come back to it as well. I'm working on the burst and sustain video together with their guide. I'm going to make it take a little bit longer. Mostly because I have maybe a new calculator in the works. I want to see if I can get it working well, as it will be a really good tool as well to put out, and together with having the guide there, and it will be an explanatory tool for me as well for in the guide. So once I have that working, then I want to put that video out. So it might be towards the end of this month, or December, or at the start of January in the new year. So my apologies for that. But yeah, you can always find me here on YouTube and in my future videos, or over on Twitch as well. We have a community Discord that is linked down below. So if you need to find me, you can always do it there as well. And we just hang out there and mostly, try to build it up and be a little community. And as always, have a good night.